Hello, everybody, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Claire Fraise, and I am an award-winning young adult author who makes videos on this channel sharing the actionable writing tips that helped me make my own writing better. I'm the author of young adult supernatural thriller They Stay, which tells the story of a 16-year-old girl whose younger brother goes missing, and she teams up with some other kids at school. One of the kids has the ability to see ghosts, and they have to find her brother. So what follows is a big paranormal adventure as she tries to find her missing brother. And yeah, this is the first in my series. The second book in the series, They Whisper, came out a couple of months ago, so I was very excited about that. And today I'm going to be doing a Q&A video. So this is my third time shooting a Q&A video, so this is not something that I've been doing for a very long time, but in these Q&As, I take questions. I usually ask people for questions on my Instagram stories or during previous Q&A videos or on different comments on the videos on this channel, and I answer the questions in these videos. So I film these videos always in one take. This is pre-recorded, but it will be broadcasted, so if you are currently in the live chat, I'm not here able to respond to that right away, but if you leave me a comment on the bottom of this video, I'm super happy to chat with you about any of the questions, or if you want to leave me a question for next time's Q&A video, definitely comment that down below. I have 5 very exciting questions that I am super excited to dive into. But before we get into that, make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I make tons of videos about writing craft, giving you all of the different pieces of advice that really helped me grow as a writer personally, things that I've heard in classes or read in books or just found as I've been experimenting and learning how to write. So I'm sharing all of the most useful stuff for me on this channel, and hopefully that will also be useful for you. So yeah, like and subscribe. And without further ado, let's dive into these questions. So, the first question that we have today is, how do you write a good enemies to lovers book? So, full disclosure for this question, I have not written an enemies to lovers romance before. I have a subplot in my series that is arguably similar. They go from being enemies to being friends and then get romantically involved, but I don't read a ton of YA fantasy, and a lot of enemies to lovers is not my favorite trope. So I'm not an expert in this, and I'm not going to try to tell you that I am. However, from a conceptual level, if I were to try to tackle an enemies to lovers story, I believe that every good enemies to lovers is non-toxic. So a big issue that I have with a lot of enemies to lovers books is that person A is, they're enemies because they're kind of horrible to each other, and maybe person A displays some toxic behavior and person B is really hurt by that, and then they're enemies, or person A did something really, really bad to person B in the past, or maybe it's situational, but person A and B are very nasty to each other and really toxic, and as soon as they get together, all of that toxicity is just brushed under the rug and people pretend like it never happened at all. I really, really hate that. I really get very frustrated when that kind of behavior is glossed over in this sort of like happy ending, tied up in a bow ending at the end of the story. So to me, the best enemies to lovers is situational enemies to lovers. So the reason person A and person B are enemies is because their families are enemies and have a big long family feud, or one is an assassin who is hired to kill the other one, or there's just some sort of situational something that is the reason that these two people are enemies. So the plot is standing in their way, and their toxic behavior is not actually super toxic, but it's them carrying out a job. Like if they're hired to kill the other person, they are hired to do that. So their behavior towards the other person is not just because they're being a jerk to that person or abusive toward that person. So that to me is the best one. So if you were thinking if you are approaching a story as you want to write an enemies to lovers story, I'd brainstorm some unique situational scenarios where two people would naturally be pitted against each other. So, whether it is the hiring to kill the other person, I see that trope frequently in young adult fantasy, but there are many, many more creative ways to do that. Or just like a unique take on that one is hired to kill the other person, or some just brainstorm some kind of situation like that. And then you can add in all of the juicy, fun tropes that come with enemies to lovers, like adding in lots of pining for the other character, or having like, the subtle attraction between characters that builds over the course of the story. And then the angry confession of love, which is the reason that so many people love reading enemies to lovers, or the, who did this scars trope where the person is seeing the other person's scars for the first time and is like, who did this to you? I would never do this to you. Or, those kind of scenes. So you can add those in after you have a sort of situation. But I think that the best enemies to lovers that I see, or the things that people love about enemies to lovers that I see on Book Talk or on Instagram, are always that it's a slow burn, and also you get like, it's also there's a steamy element to it where you have, one character who's pressing a knife against the other character's throat and is also turned like attracted to them in some way. So I think the trick with enemies to lovers is figuring out how to convey that attraction between the characters in a way that you're showing it and not telling it, because the characters themselves are enemies and they don't want to be attracted to that other person, but they can't help it. So I'm actually doing this with the book I'm writing right now. I'm working on this, is trying to figure out ways to show attraction between two characters that are very subtle. So even because I write in first person present tense point of view, so everything is very grounded in point of view. So I've been focusing on trying to figure out ways that one character can notice certain things about the other character, like noticing the way that, or noticing the way that they're dressed, or the way that they smell, or maybe like their hands touch as they're both reaching for something, or just being more aware of that character. And that is like a way that you can describe it. So try to figure out little subtle ways that you can show the attraction. Most of that is just noticing. So make sure you're not saying flat out like, oh, I'm attracted to this person, and find little creative ways to show that, because you want that to come through the writing instead of just being smacking the reader over the head with it. So that was a lot. So to sum up an answer to that question, you have to make sure to make your enemies to lovers situational. You want to make it trope heavy, because a lot of readers who love enemies to lovers love these tropes that go along with it. You want to make it a slow burn if you can, and not have them, super hot and heavy right at the beginning, and have them slowly realize the attraction and then have it, come to a head later. And then you want to find creative ways to show the attraction between the characters in very small moments. So focusing on those 4 things. All right, so moving on to our second question, which is, how soon should the inciting incident occur in your book? I like to have my inciting incidents occur at the end of chapter 1. That's what I did with my book They Stay, but it wasn't always like that. In my earlier drafts, I had my inciting incident happen in around chapter 4 or 5, but I always find as a reader that I become most invested in the story after the inciting incident happens, because every single story has some sort of major overarching conflict. You have characters that have goals, and then you have things that are standing in the way of them achieving those goals. And their desire to achieve the goals is in conflict with those things standing in the way of them achieving their goals. Sometimes, it's another character who wants different goals than they do, the antagonist character, and you have this kind of conflict. There is no story where everything is just calm all the time and everybody's happy. The story is this conflict. So I become most invested in a story as a reader once that conflict starts. So the sooner you can get into that conflict, the better. And that's why I moved my inciting incident to the end of my first chapter, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, my book follows this girl whose younger brother goes missing, and then she starts, looking for him and discovering some other supernatural things happening in the town. But that incident of the brother going missing is the inciting incident of the story. So originally, when I wrote the book, I wanted to set up the town. I wanted to set up her relationship with her brother. I wanted to introduce some of the other major players who would later become important in the story before the brother went missing. So I think in my first chapter, I had the younger brother at baseball practice, And then I had her going to school and like seeing her boyfriend and seeing this other weird girl at school who she didn't really talk to and seeing the guy she didn't really like in the halls and then going back and seeing her brother and picking him up and then going home. And then you get introduced to their unstable family life at home. And then after that, her brother goes missing. But by the time all of that was over, it had been a couple of chapters. And I remember getting some feedback early on when I don't exactly remember how I got this feedback, but it was probably beta reader feedback or professor feedback that it took a while for people to be invested in the story. And so I moved things around and had Shiloh's younger brother Max go missing at the end of chapter 1. So now my new revised version has Shiloh getting Max ready in the morning to go to t-ball practice. Then she walks him to t-ball practice, and they're leaving the house and you get to be introduced to their unstable family situation, and she drops him off at t-ball practice and they say goodbye. I think I had a bit of a sound issue. Want to make sure that's working before I continue recording this video, but it looks like it is, so I think we're good. So then she is at t-ball. She drops him off at t-ball practice, and then he goes to t-ball practice and she goes to work, and she is worried that someone's going to forget to pick him up. And then at the end, her dad forgets to go pick him up from t-ball practice, and then he goes missing. So then the chapter ends with Shiloh realizing that Max is missing. So then the chapter ends, and then it moves on to the next character and introduces the next protagonist. So because I bring the conflict in, by chapter 2, I'm already able to dive into the supernatural elements happening in the town and introducing other characters. And then the other characters who I focused on introducing earlier in the book are able to be brought into the story where they are organically starting to enter the story. So I would argue end of chapter 1 if possible. If not possible, maybe definitely within the first 4 chapters of the book. I would say as soon as possible, because that is going to be the moment where I think you're really going to hook readers into your story. It's always the moment that I get hooked into the story. It's always tough for me to get into stories when I start reading. So the sooner that inciting incident happens for me, the sooner I'm able to be invested. So that's my opinion, but I'm sure other people have different opinions than me. And also, if you have a story that requires a lot more world building than mine did, because mine's set in a contemporary world, you might need to have 1 or 2 more chapters before you get to the inciting incident, because setup can be very important. Okay, or I'll say within first 5 chapters. Chapter 1 if you don't need a lot of world building. Moving on to our third question, which is, what do you advise for revising a first chapter to effectively introduce the protagonists and concisely while also being engaging? So this is a very good question, because overwhelming the readers by introducing many characters at the same time is not a good thing. I know also as a reader, when I'm reading a book and many characters are introduced in the first chapter, I'm unable to keep track of which characters are which, and they stop losing much meaning to me as a reader, and I'm not able to keep track of them in my head, and it's not very engaging because I can't connect to any character. Usually the protagonist of the story is the emotional rock for your readers. Like, your readers are able, or should be able, to connect to your protagonist. That's the protagonist's role in your story, is to allow the reader to connect to them so that the reader themselves can be taken through the events of the story. Because if your reader identifies with the protagonist in some way, they can experience the story more viscerally than if they were just looking on from the outside. So if you introduce many protagonists at once, you're not really allowing the reader to have time to connect to the one character that you want them to connect to as they travel through the story. And you can have multiple protagonists, and that's totally fine, but you want to make sure that you give your readers time to get to know them instead of introducing them all at once. So I would say that I wouldn't introduce more than just a couple of characters, maybe 4 to 5 characters max in your first chapter. And that includes, family members of your main character or friends of your main character. I might try to introduce your protagonists in detail a little separately instead of just both introducing them at the same time, just to keep things a little bit less overwhelming for the readers. But yeah, I think that the second part of your question also asks about being engaging and how to introduce characters concisely while also being engaging. And I think that the best way to introduce characters in any story is always through scenes. I think if you can create active scenes that are relevant to who your characters are as a person or the journey that they're going to go on over the course of the book, that is super awesome because you're able to just pull readers into the world and into the scene, and you can put a lot of other things about your story into a scene that you can't if you're just standing or not standing there because the reader doesn't stand inside their own story. But if you're just sitting there writing your story and writing a couple paragraphs about who this character is and what their life story is. So, if you haven't actually already, I would go watch my video on the Grace Year that I published a couple of weeks ago. I made a video on the young adult dystopian or speculative feminist thriller, The Grace Year by Kim Lidgett, and that is a fantastic example of how to bring people into your world and introduce characters in a very active way. Kim Lidgett creates these scenes that are very rich and dynamic and interesting and are very pertinent to who the characters are and the roles that they play in the story and also the journeys that they go on. Because I'll talk about my book as an example because I know, it's easier for me to do that because I understand all of the reasoning behind why I chose to do certain things in the first chapter. But I chose to introduce my main character, Shiloh, with her younger brother Max because her connection to her younger brother Max is the most important element of her character over the course of the book. And when he goes missing, it's the worst thing that she could ever possibly imagine happening to her. It just guts her, it rocks her entire world, and she just doesn't know, she can't function or think properly until he's rescued. Like, she needs to go find him, and her desire to protect him is the driving force behind the story. So it was always really important to me to introduce her with him. So what I decided to do was write a scene where she's getting him ready for t-ball practice, and he really doesn't want to go and he's having a tantrum, but because of their unsteady household growing up, she's had to step into this parental role for him. So she is telling him, you have to go, and she's helping him put on his clothes and helping him get ready, and they have this interaction where already right on the first page there's a conflict because she knows that he needs to go and he doesn't want to go, so they're kind of fighting a little bit. But it also just shows how much she loves him and shows how much she cares for him and how protective she is over him when they leave his bedroom after, like, on their way to go out the door, and they have to step over broken shards of glass from the episode that their father had the day before, and just all of these different little things that are coloring the world, instead of Shiloh just sitting down and saying, oh yeah, my name is Shiloh, I have a younger brother, I am, I don't really have a great relationship with my dad. Instead of listing all those things, the scene is able to effectively show them. And I did, like, it's also because her relationship with her brother is important. It was, I believe, a better decision for me to show her in a scene with her brother than it was for me to show her in a scene with her boyfriend when I first introduced her, because her connection to her brother is so much more important than her connection with her boyfriend over the course of the book. So that's how keeping it active would be my main point for keeping it engaging. And also for introducing characters, I have this rule of thumb that I really, really love. I don't know where I originally heard this piece of writing advice, but I think it was somehow connected to Harry Potter. How when you are describing a character physically, choose one physical characteristic that's unique, that stands out from other characteristics, and use that to describe your character in different scenes. So instead of saying, character A had blonde hair and blue eyes, character B had brown hair and green eyes, and character C had red hair and green eyes, say character A had a scar on her chin or a mole on her chin, and character B had like wild curly, like frizzy red hair, and character C had a pair of glasses that was broken in the middle with tape on the, like, holding the lenses together. Just some sort of little physical descriptor like that that's brought up repeatedly when you introduce that character or when you bring that character into the story, that can help readers formulate an image of that character better than if all of the character descriptions are kind of muddied. bonus points if the piece of character description reflects some part of their personality. So, if your character is very book smart and loves to read, and maybe, their one character description has something to do with glasses, or if, you have another character who is really tough and is like, a very good at boxing or something, like maybe they have like a lump on the middle of their nose because they got punched in the face from boxing, and like that's part of their character that's relevant to the story because they have to whip out those crazy boxing skills to defeat the villain later on in the story. So things like that are relevant. I'd isolate maybe one or two of those things for every single one of your characters so that you can paint a picture of your cast easier than just through generic descriptions like hair color or eye color. So for example, mine for Shiloh in my book They Stay is her sad brown eyes, and Max, her younger brother, has the same sad brown eyes. So I bring that in first when Shiloh comments on Max's sad brown eyes because he doesn't want to go to T-ball practice and he's having a bit of a tantrum. And she's like, "Oh yeah, my mom has always told me that I have the same eyes," and that's how she's able to bring her character description in. So I hope that helped. If you want to let me know actually in the comments below how many protagonists you have and a little bit more specific detail around your story, I'd be super happy to give you my more specific feedback. But from a general standpoint, that is what I would advise. So moving on to our fourth question, which is, do you believe a romance novel should always have a happy ending? So again, not a romance author, but I do read romance books, and I have very strong opinions about this. So my answer in short would be yes. I strongly believe that romance novels should always have happy endings. And to me, this comes down really just to genre expectations. I think that you have to ask yourself why people read romance books. I personally read romance books because I like getting caught up in the characters and the relationships, and also, to get lost in the fantasy of their relationships and different characters and their dynamics and everything. And because I get really invested in these relationships, I and also identify sometimes with the main protagonists of these different books, and it's escapism, like, to read these books. I don't want the fantasy that I have been living in my head while reading this book to have a really unhappy ending because I read it to get the pleasure of getting lost in this relationship that is somewhat of a fantasy, because that's a lot of the point of the romance genre and the reason that a lot of people read romance books. So when the relationships don't turn out well, it feels somewhat personal, like they haven't turned out well for me as the reader. And that is sad and makes me feel cheated. So I strongly believe that they should have happy endings. And just away from the genre expectations thing, I think that in general, like there's this book on craft that I really love, actually, that I will share my screen and show you the Amazon page for this book on craft because I'm obsessed with this book and it has changed the way that I think about storytelling. So this is a book, it's called Dynamic Story Creation by Maxwell Alexander Drake, and it posits that every story has a universal thematic human question that it puts forth through the events of the story. So every single story is trying to answer some sort of major thematic question. For example, like Finding Nemo presents an overprotective father, Marlin, who is smothering his child Nemo because, he had a lot of trauma because he lost his wife and his other fish children, and he just wants Nemo to be safe, and so he's very overprotective. And because he is so overprotective, Nemo is whisked away, and then Marlin goes on this journey to go find Nemo. Meanwhile, Nemo goes through this journey of becoming more independent, and as Marlin learns that maybe it's better to not be as overprotective as he is and to give Nemo some room to self-actualize and do things on his own and be independent, things are better and it's better for Nemo. And so the general question that this story argues is it better for a parent to be overprotective or to give their kids space to learn how to be independent. And every single time that Marlin is very overprotective in the story, something bad happens. And every single time that Marlin gives Nemo space, something good happens. So, because this is the major thing that the story is arguing, if and there is a right answer in the world of the story because events go well when the question is answered in the way that the story universe presents. If the climax happened and like this was the major thematic question and Marlin's entire journey has been to learn this one giant lesson, if the climax happened and Marlin was still super overprotective of Nemo, something bad happened and maybe Nemo was lost forever, then that would be a tragedy because he didn't rise to the occasion and answer the thematic question of the story in the way that the story challenged him to do. So, in the same vein as this, I hope that I explained that somewhat coherently. Maxwell Alexander Drake explains it really, really well in this book. So, if any of that resonated with you or engaged your curiosity at all, definitely go check out that book because it's fantastic. So, in the same vein, when you're writing a romance novel, you want that novel to have a major thematic question. For example, if you are maybe writing a second chance romance, you can pose the question, is it possible for two people who had a bad relationship before to have a good relationship after they have grown as people and are trying again? And like, are they able to overcome the trauma? And so you can explore that question. And if the story ends with a tragedy, like they are not able to rise to the major thematic question of the story by the end of it, and then they are like the relationship is a disaster, it would be a tragedy. It wouldn't be a like normal story. So I hope that makes sense. Going back, I mean, generally my answer is yes, I do believe that they should have happy endings because of reader expectations. But if you're interested in learning any more about that theme stuff, definitely go check out this book because I cannot recommend it highly enough and talk about it all the time. So, all right, moving on to our last question, which is what is your process when the words just don't come out? I am dealing with this. Actually, I have been dealing with this a lot this summer. And so I have been thinking about it a lot this summer. And honestly, what I would recommend is routine. I really cannot write as well as I can otherwise when I don't have a routine. I feel all scatterbrained. I can't get myself to focus in the way that I want to. But when I'm sitting down at the computer at the same time every day, I am able to snap into that headspace a lot better because I guess I can just rely on it, or subconsciously my brain is like, okay, it's time to write. And then I'm able to get into the zone a lot better. So, my first tip for proactively trying to correct this would be to establish a very rigid writing routine. Things got kind of tricky for me this summer because of visiting family and different. I'm doing a big home renovation project right now. And so the weekly schedules are just all thrown up in the air because it's very hard to get things done. But now that this week I just sat down and I tried to really reestablish this routine. And as soon as I did that, I was able to write again and everything just started feeling better. And I felt like I was making progress again and just felt generally a lot better about my story. If you are unable to create a routine just time wise that is the same every day, I would challenge you to try to create mini routines that you do every time you sit down to write. So whether that's having the same kind of tea or maybe a cup of coffee every time that you sit down to write, then eventually your brain, or at least my brain when I do that, will start to associate that coffee or tea with writing, or maybe you listen to the same song every time or the same playlist, and that will maybe start helping your brain snap into that writing phase or writing place so you're able to focus on the words better. I think also writing in sprints can help and really just forcing those words out, even though if it feels stilted. I just found that if you just sit down at the computer and force out the words, even if it's just a couple, like 100 words every day, just not stopping writing and just keep moving forward does help me because eventually it keeps the wheels going and it keeps me moving forward and it becomes easier for me to get into the zone again when things start clicking. I would also sometimes there's a reason for the words not coming out. Sometimes there is an issue with a chapter or a scene or some sort of structural issue with the story. So I would examine and see maybe if there is an issue with the chapter. If you're struggling to get words written in a particular chapter, maybe there's just something wrong with the chapter. I would look at maybe why it's hard to write and if there are ways for you to make it more exciting for yourself to write it, because that can really help. But I really sympathize with this because I've been struggling a lot with this over the summer. So routine really helps me. And then trying to, or like timing routine. So writing first thing in the morning is my favorite thing to do. And then if I can't do that, then doing like, the same cup of tea every time I go and sit down to write or something like that can really help me snap into the zone. But don't stop writing. That's the worst thing you can do. That's what I did. And it was really hard for me to get back into it. And then I felt really bad about myself because I wasn't putting in the words and I just was getting all scatterbrained. And as soon as I started being really structured again, everything came together. So I hope that helps. I know exactly how you feel because I've been feeling the exact same way, but I promise that it gets better and this feeling does pass. Okay. Cool. So those are all the questions that I have for this Q&A video. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, make sure to like it and to subscribe to my channel. I love filming these because it's so casual and I film them all in one take. And so it feels like I'm just able to sit down and chat with you all. And so if you have any questions that you want me to discuss in a future Q&A video, please, please, please comment them on this video or on another one of my videos. I would love to talk about them. And make sure to make them specific. If you have any specific questions about your story, tell me about your story and your characters, and I will tackle the question in a future video. So thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a fantastic week, and as always, happy writing.